Hello, friends. I want to speak about two people who changed the world. And these people might have been very well looked at a point in their lives as nobodies, as people who were least expected to have that kind of an impact on the world. The first of these people is Moses. And Moses lived a long time ago, 4,000 years ago, and the world was, of course, very, very different. And maybe it was more like 3,500 years ago. But Moses, as the story of Moses that we have tells us, began his life as a prince, as a royal prince in the house of Pharaoh in Egypt. And the way that this happened was a circumstance that was very unique. And it's not too important to look at that, but the fact was that he spent the first 40 years of his life and in Pharaoh's court, and that these years were probably spent, we don't know for sure, but it's easy to project that these were years wasted for him, that they were uh, years in which he was a hedonist and in which he partook of the royal uh, lifestyle and was probably not a very deep or introspective person at that point in his life. But something happened right when he was 40 years old or thereabouts that caused him to flee from the land of Egypt and not go back. He basically became a renegade, and what happened was that he killed an Egyptian guard who was, or an Egyptian taskmaster or slave driver who was beating an Israelite worker or an Israelite slave. And Moses rose up and when he saw this, and he came to the rescue of the Israelite slave and ended up killing this Egyptian taskmaster. And this, of course, was in Moses's mind. He had to leave. There was no way to. It was a deed that was witnessed by others. So there was really no way for him to deny or to try and explain it. And so he chose to just leave. And at that point, he ended up going out into the wilderness um, east of Egypt, south of what we now know as the land of Israel. And he took up residence there. It was a barren, forsaken place where he figured that not only would no one find him there, but that he could just hide for the rest of his life, and that he was at that point probably so desperate, feeling that that was the best he could do for himself for the rest of his life. And as it ended up happening, he did meet a group of people, a tribe that were living there in the desert, and he linked up with them and got married and started a family. And he actually found employment in the service of his father-in-law as a shepherd that would that he could take his father-in-law's sheep out each day in search of green pasture. And in doing this work, Moses spent a very long stretch of his life, another 40 years according to the Bible, uh, doing very little else other than thinking, um, being with himself, by himself, with the sheep, but not with other human beings, and thinking about what had happened, what the first 40 years of his life had been all about, and basically just he became a very spiritual man at that point, a very deeply spiritual man who every day he was by himself, and every day he was able to connect with his inner self, his inner world, and to feel what was going on inside of him. And so this was the kind of a person that he became during those years. And of course, people don't really change. So it actually was probably the kind of person he always had been, but when he lived in Egypt and he was doing as the Egyptians did, of course that introspective person had no expression. But once he left Egypt and found himself in this situation where he was completely alone every day, this spiritual part of him began to come to the surface very strongly and to find expression. And Moses spent 40 years doing this. And he definitely came to a place of deep understanding within himself about life and about spiritual reality. And still, though, we would have to say that until Moses was 80 years old, he was not exactly a powerful mover of human culture. He was very much a nobody. He was a renegade, and he was a shepherd, and he was a loner, and he was a nobody, and nobody paid any attention to him or thought that he had anything to offer them or the world or human society. And then something very interesting happened, according to the story. When Moses was 80, and it's an interesting fact that his life span was divided into three 40-year periods. And when the second period, this deeply introspective period, ended at the age of 80, something happened, and there was an event that took place. And it didn't involve other people. It involved the entire cachet of inner knowledge and inner introspective searching that he had been doing coming out in a very powerful way one day. It happened in a single day. And he was still shepherding, and he had the flock with him that day. And he had gone to a place that he had been other times before in the desert. And and he noticed something very strange. He noticed a bush, a small tree, a bush, very barren looking, uh, aflame. It was on fire. And this in itself was not entirely unusual. It was so hot in that realm that plants like that, barren plants, could actually ignite and catch fire just from the sun, from the heat of the sun. But Moses watched this and he knew that something was strange because the little bush, which should have been consumed by this fire in a matter of minutes or seconds, even, this little bush did not stop burning. The fire kept going. And so Moses drew near, and he was drawn to this because it was very curious to him why this bush uh, was not, the fire was not going out. And it was at this point that he heard a voice, and it was a very powerful voice telling him that he needed to go back to the land of Egypt and become a shepherd to the people of Israel and lead them out of the land of Egypt, where they had been slaves for 400 years. And he was being called by this voice to be the one to lead them forth. And so that's what he did. And this began his third 40-year period of life, and he became an entirely different person at this point. He was no longer the loner shepherd living in the wilderness. He was now a very social being once again, but having come into this deep spiritual knowledge, he was very focused on the task before him, which was to lead the people out of Egypt and onward to the promised land, to the land promised to their forefathers. And so this happened to him, and he definitely ceased to be a nobody at that point. He became not only a savior type figure to the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and completing the task that he was sent to do, with the workings of miracles and power, spiritual power. He not only changed the fate of the Jewish people at that point, but he also ended up changing the world, because as they were sojourning in the wilderness near the promised land, Moses was instrumental in changing the consciousness of the entire nation of the people of Israel. and raising their consciousness into a more enlightened state in which they lived at that point um, by law. They were given law and they were shown a much better way to live than they had been living before. And this was a precursor. It was for human civilization in general to come into more light and to come into um, a higher state of consciousness, a greater civilization. Um, and so Moses became the architect of, of human civilization from that point forward. And because the law that he ended up bringing to the Jewish people was written down and preserved for future generations of all people, all human beings. So Moses changed the world, and he became one of the most famous men in the world. And he had been for 80 years a nobody. And the other person that I would like to talk about is Jesus. Because most people, when they think of Jesus, they can't imagine him ever being a nobody. um, they think that he was God, and if you're God, you're God from birth. So, but the fact is that the first 30 years of Jesus's life were very quiet, and as far as we know, and they were years spent very much like Moses's years in the second uh, part of his 40-year segments. The second segment in when he was a shepherd in the wilderness, and Jesus was, the best we can tell, until he was 30. This was his life was very quiet and unpresuming, and he was definitely not a public figure or anybody great before he was 30. He was a learner, and he was probably a loner also. And he learned a great deal within himself, within his own consciousness and his own inner being. He delved deeply like Moses did, and he learned a tremendous amount. But this was not something that the world appreciated. So he was a nobody. He was somebody who, I mean, when you think about it, in both Moses's case and Jesus's case, the somebodies of the world were and always have been the rulers of the great nations, the officials, the um, uh, all of the people who wielded human power and who wielded human influence and strength. Those have always been the somebodies of human society. But in both of these cases, in Moses and Jesus, um, these men were definitely not movers and shakers of human society at, before these transition points. They were quiet men, and they were introspective. they kept to themselves. And so to think of this of Jesus in this way, it might take a little bit of stretching for your imagination. But the fact is that until he was 30, he was not known, and he had not done anything that caught the public's attention. And so we might say that he was a nobody until that point. And then, as the record shows, when he was 30, he went and he left his home in Nazareth and in Galilee, and he went and he joined his cousin, John the Baptist, who was preaching uh, on a daily basis. He was preaching a baptism of repentance down by the Jordan River. And Jesus went to John and joined up with him. And it just so happens that this movement, this baptismal ministry of John, was just taking off very strongly as a thriving sort of movement, that many of the Israelites were being drawn to John and to his message. And there was a great stirring in the land on account of this. And that's not why Jesus joined him. It wasn't that Jesus was trying to, he wasn't an opportunist trying to get on board with a movement that was popular. Jesus joined him because of something internal, a calling that was similar to Moses's, that Jesus heard an inner voice before he was 30, just before he was 30, that told him to go, that told him to begin his public ministry. And the rest is history, where we find that Jesus met some of the young men at the camp, at John's camp down by the river, and they became his first disciples. And once Jesus had a few disciples, they left John's camp and they began to go out on their own throughout the land of Israel and to minister to the people, and to heal, and to alleviate suffering wherever they went, and to teach. And we can definitely say that there was this point where Jesus went from being a nobody to being a very great somebody. And the interesting thing about Jesus is this, though. It wasn't what he did, and it wasn't what he said that made him great. And this is going to trouble some people, because his teaching has shown itself to be timeless and very wonderful. And of course, what he did with his miraculous works these were works that have no parallel in human history. They were works of mercy, works of healing, works of miraculous works, of showing control over nature and materialistic energies. They were amazing works, but that was not even, as much as this is an absolute truth that these were miracles, this was not what made Jesus a somebody. What made him a somebody is the same thing that made Moses a somebody, and that is who Jesus was inwardly as a human being and what he was called to do. Moses was called for a very specific task to lead the people into the promised land, and then on the way to impart to them the law that would improve human life for the entire uh, species of mankind. And Jesus was called to do the same thing. He was called to be an example for us of a higher state of consciousness, to show us that man, the species of Homo sapiens, is um, so great, so has such great potential to be more than it had been up until then, and even now. It has an incredible potential. And this is what Jesus showed us. Uh, he was not somebody at that point because of the things he did or said. It was because of who he was. And he was a man that showed us Christ consciousness. And why is this important? Because human life uh, is very much defined by our state of consciousness. It always has been. And from the very beginning, when Adam uh, experienced the awakening of consciousness, human life has been defined by and limited by the state of consciousness. And what that means is that human life has been, in many ways, dark and a struggle and filled with suffering because lower states of consciousness produce um, circumstances that are difficult for all human beings. And this is what both Moses and Jesus did. Moses brought light, brought higher consciousness to the human scene through the law and through the giving of the law and through showing people a better way to live, a more civilized way to live. And Jesus went further. Jesus showed us Christ consciousness, which is a higher state of consciousness. It is a state of uh, almost the opposite of the Adamic state that we have been moving in as a species. The Adamic state is a state of separation and a state of human strength, making your own way, and a state in which evil is very hard for us to resist. And Jesus showed us Christ consciousness as an alternative, as a state in which we are no longer separate, but we are completely uh, unified with one another and with God. And once this idea of union, of perfect harmonious union with God and the universe and our fellow man, once this was presented to mankind, we have never been the same. We have been evolving in consciousness since then, and very greatly. And there have been many, many people that have individually come in to what we might think of as a saint-like state of consciousness, in which they do no violence, in which they um, would not do evil, um, but have power within themselves to resist evil, and in which they no longer live desperately by human strength, but rather they live through trust and they live through rest in God. And this is a state of being that Jesus showed us that has been changing the world and is continuing to change the world. And every bit of light that human society has um, had in these past 2,000 years to guide us in our evolutionary movement, every bit of light has improved human life. It has made human life richer, fuller, and better, goodness. Um, and that is how Jesus went from being a nobody to a somebody. And um, these both of these men, before a certain point in their life, might have been looked at as having nothing to offer the world. And we see that instead they turned out to be two of the most influential and greatest uh, uh, humanitarian uh, people among us.